Previously, in Hedge Knights, all of the salix trees were replanted outside the boundary wall. The carpenters added in a walled entryway tunnel to control the flow of incoming enemies. A large swarm of reptiles attacked the castle, and the Adlets used the opportunity to hone their archery skills. Sapo and Megahoof ventured out for salix trees and found a glade that lacked any pristine grove. Episode 35: Klein's Weaving. Lazarus asked Klein how soon he would be able to get to work weaving textiles that were superior to that of linen or wool for clothing. Klein thought a minute, and then said that he could start trying to blend gossapium and wool together, but the resulting textile would likely be unbearably hot, so it would be best to wait for flax to ripen, and to incorporate the linen into the blended mix as well. Lazarus said the flax would be ready for reaping in just a day or two, so it wouldn't be long. A look of delight shot across Klein's face. Judea started to pace out the markers for the 3 spots for the new salix trees that her husband and Sapo would be returning with soon. The boundary arboretum was filling out quite nicely. Huge tracts of land were already protected by salix trees, and Megahoof's desire to distill additional extracts made sure that the buffered areas were expanding almost every week. Just as she finished marking the new locations, Sapo and Megahoof arrived, soaking wet and looking somewhat miserable. Megahoof explained to Judea that the area they found the new trees in lacked any sort of grove, so they mostly skipped sleeping and worked through the night and in the rain, to return as quickly as possible. Sapo noticed Judea's tree marker upon returning home and saw that several gray pine trees were already nearby and would need to be cut down in order to make room for the salix. He grabbed his wood axe and headed to prepare the spot for replanting. He asked the other Adlets to help sledge the trees into position. He was already overly taxed from travel. Working in the driving rain made moving salix trees difficult and dangerous. The marshy soil snagged the sledges, and the bison often struggled to find solid footing. Ideally, the work would be done in clear and dry weather, but Megahoof hadn't tested the hybrid extracts for long-term preservation of uprooted salix trees, and worried that it only delayed the decaying process. It might be worth testing how long salix trees were viable uprooted once treated with the extract. But while the Adlets were cleaning the castle grounds, they needed every tree possible to handle the pollution. Klein gave Lazarus some sketched clothing patterns that he used when making clothing for Pennacook for their scouts. He explained how the best clothing needed to cover as much exposed fur as possible, and that wearing layers was ideal so the innermost layer would remain clean and keep the wearer safe. He told Lazarus he wasn't much of a tailor, so he'd handle the making of the blended fabrics while leaving the tailoring to him. Klein went on to explain the weaving process. He would spin the gossapium into extremely tight cloth and then incorporate that into layers of wool and linen, stitching the layers so they formed a single bolt of blended fabric. The fabric would be extremely dense but not offer much protection from blades, warhammers, or arrows, so it should be used as an inner lining, which would also keep it from degrading and losing its protective properties. The patterns he provided were for a hood incorporating a mask, a cloak, boots, and gloves, which when worn together and used properly, could almost perfectly protect the wearer, but it did come with some drawbacks. Due to their heft and weight, it was difficult to move and work in them, and they were also a poor substitute for hardened iron or steel, so wearing it into combat was a terrible idea. Lazarus thanked Klein for the clothing patterns and carefully explained details. The Adlets had attempted to wait for the rain to stop so that replanting the salix trees was easier and safer, but it became clear that the driving rain wasn't going to cease anytime soon, so Megahoof and Mazzy grabbed 2 sledges and rounded up enough bison to haul the trees towards the marked spots. In his tired stupor, Megahoof had sloppily marked the wrong spot to haul toxic waste to, and he was too busy scarfing cold and soggy pumpkin fritters to bother correcting his mistake. Luckily, the narrator noticed and made a note for future correction. The heavy rains did help the Adlets with making sure the farm crops were properly watered, and also dramatically increased how quickly the soils around the salix trees would reabsorb the pollution that was hauled out to them. For the third time, Sapo had to cut down a gray pine sapling to make way for the last transplanted salix tree. He quickly uprooted the sapling and then dug a hole for the tree and then packed down the polluted soil around the roots. He then headed to make sure the other two trees that Madzi and Megahoof had planted were still intact. He worried that the soil was so saturated with rainwater that it could turn into a muddy slurry and the trees would topple without the support of stabilizing soil. As a result of another bumper crop harvest for heelroot for medicine, Megahoof wasted no time distilling up another triple batch of hybrid extract. He knew he'd have to give the bison some time to rest and recuperate. They were hardy, but still suffered from the same pollution ailments as he did. While Klein and Lazarus were experimenting with fabrics and cloths in order to protect everyone for long-distance travel, there still remained the issue of protecting bison for travel. Despite being mostly domesticated, the bison refused to be ridden or wear anything on their heads. The best the Adlets could do is to fashion them with saddlebags and harnesses for caravanning bulk goods or hauling sledges with salix trees. But there wasn't going to be a way to cover the bison in order to protect them from pollution. The Adlets wouldn't be able to travel to the ruins with the bison without setting up another way station or two to allow the bison to recuperate, and as a result, the Adlets would likely head to the ruins without them. Spending the entire season setting up way stations was too dangerous, and provisions wouldn't likely last. Klein cleaned the gossypium puffs and then spun the fiber into fine threads, and then weaved the threads into tightly woven bolts of cloth. His decades of practice to master the craft of weaving clearly showed. He made what would otherwise be time-consuming, complicated, and frustrating into what almost seemed effortless. He carefully set the bolts of cloth aside, awaiting the flax harvest so he could spin flax into linen, the final ingredient he needed for pollution protection fabric. Lazarus and Sapo weren't sure how cold-hardy the gossypium plants were. They instructed Klein to stockpile the seeds he plucked from the puff bowls, and reserved some of the seeds for next year's sowing, while using some to resow the fields despite the fact that it was already summer. They thought it might be possible the crops would either grow enough before winter, or survive the winter. There was much that was unknown about the strange fibrous plant, and the farmers were eager to experiment. Tilling the soil while avoiding the ambrosia bushes created an unexpected problem. The farm fields were slightly sloped, at only a few degrees to the south, and as a result, when it rained a lot, it would flow through the farm fields and then eventually drain out towards the southern edge of the curtain wall. Tilling while avoiding the ambrosia bushes caused water to pool up where the soil couldn't be tilled, and Sapo worried that the pooled water might harm both ambrosia and psychoid plants. Sapo had noticed that the ambrosia went through natural waves of dormancy, where the bushes would crop up, go through several cycles of fruiting, and then disappear almost as fast as they burst up through the soil. When the ambrosia would go dormant again, they could till the soil where the bushes had once been. Now that rainwater was pooling around the untilled soil, it seemed urgent to create earthen waterways to alleviate the flooding. Sapo and Judea examined the bison to assess whether or not it would be safe to head to yet another glade. While the bison did show some low-lying sluggishness from exposure, It wasn't dire enough to halt their excursion, so Sapo gave the go-ahead that it would be safe to plan another Salix caravan. Sapo and Megahoof both felt well enough to head back out together. They had managed to fetch the last batch of Salix trees so quickly that neither they nor the bison had been stricken ill. The plan was to stock the pantry with enough food to last a day or two and then depart. They hoped the weather would hold up. It had only recently stopped raining, and trudging through polluted mud and muck made uprooting Salix trees particularly unpleasant. Lazarus brought in an armful of raw flax and tapped Klein on the shoulder and pointed to it on the shelf to let him know it was ready for him. Lazarus said more flax and raw gossypium would be on its way as well. There was still plenty of plants waiting to mature. Klein grabbed some of the flax and readied it for weaving with use of a flax break and sketching knife to soften the fibers. Any fibers that weren't long enough for proper fabric could be repurposed for burlap to haul away polluted topsoil. He didn't plan to weave the linen tightly, but instead planned to have it be breathable, so it could be used as the innermost layer of the blended fabric, so the clothing made from the blend wouldn't be too insulating. Klein also inquired about the double strand and what it could be used for, as he heard it was for clothing, but he had never seen it before. Sapo told him that the squire's original community used it for durable clothing, but that he and Lazarus failed to grow it to maturity in the bison glade because the fibrous fungal cap grew very slowly and died easily in colder temperatures. While it might be possible they'd managed to harvest it for the first time this year, he told Klein that he shouldn't plan on incorporating it into the fabric blend until they could manage to reliably harvest it, and that hadn't been the case so far. The shelves were full of old tattered clothing that the Adlets were saving for emergency use. Megahoof asked the other squires if they thought it was time to clear out the shelves of tattered clothing to make way for the new blended fabric garments. Everyone agreed it was the best course of action. Lazarus told Sapo and Megahoof not to depart for Salix trees just yet. Klein had finished a few batches of the new blended fabric, and he wanted to attempt to use the pattern for a protective hood that Klein had given him to fashion a new mast hood for them both to wear. Lazarus said he didn't want to waste the blended fabric if the patterns didn't work, so they'd both be guinea pigs testing out whether or not the hooded mask was breathable, comfortable, and not too insulating, all while also offering improved protection to the elements. Megahoof didn't love the idea of being a guinea pig, but Sapo reassured him that even if the hooded masks didn't work at all, the amount of exposure that they'd be subjected to would still be tolerable. Lazarus took great care in handling the blended cloth. The gossypium threads and bison wool were intertwined with an inner lining of breathable linen. He took care to measure and cut each piece of the pattern, stitching it together with a blended thread made from both wool and gossypium. The pattern also called for an outer layer shell as well, ideally using leather or hide. But since the islets had such an absurd abundance of bison wool, the plan was to use wool instead. Because the protective clothing was still cumbersome, it didn't make sense to wear it for combat, so incorporating leather into the clothing would be wasteful, as leather was more ideal for clothing used on the battlefield. Lazarus had finished 2 prototype hoods and offered them to Sapo and Megahoof to wear on their Salix-bound trip. As soon as Sapo swapped his face mask for the new hood, a wave of acidic smog rolled into the glade. While the smog seemed cyclical and more or less inevitable, the timing of the unfortunate smog was impeccable. Immediately, Sapo told Lazarus that breathing with the mask on was notably easier and his lungs burned a little less while outside in the acrid vapors. Whether there'd be long-term health benefits from wearing the masked hood over the regular face mask was still not known. but so far the hooded mass seemed to be a step in the right direction. Sapo and Megahoof both felt satisfied with the initial performance of the new masks and started to pack for their trip. Megahoof laughed with Sapo about how yet again the weather turned sour right as they planned to depart. But at least they had high-quality masks to help mitigate the smog, whereas last trip they didn't have good clothing to deal with the driving rain. They also knew that smog was very localized, so when leaving the castle behind they'd likely be venturing into cleaner air anyway. Just like last time, Sapo and Megahoof packed a minimal amount of hay and provisions, planning to spend as little time as possible away from the castle. They told the others they'd be headed roughly northbound yet again, and departed into the dense green-hued billowing smog. Lazarus planned to prototype some additional protective clothing, tailoring up boots, gloves, and a cloak to maximize coverage. Klein advised against using the blended fabric for trousers and tunics, as the benefits of slightly better toxic protection didn't outweigh the additional encumbrance from wearing thick and heavy clothing. If the boots, gloves, and cloak didn't end up protecting the adlets well enough from pollution, he could always prototype tunics and trousers if the need arose. Lazarus then realized Sapo had left him with a massive amount of work tending to the giant farm full of maturing crops. He wanted to spend time carefully tailoring new articles of clothing using Klein's fabrics and patterns, but that would have to wait. He grumbled to himself as he choked from the bitter air, struggling to breathe while harvesting the matured heelroot, gossypium, and flax. He wished the youngins in the castle showed more interest and aptitude tending crops, as the growing community had increased demand for both food and textiles, but not increased help from farmhands. Once Megahoof returned, he would broach the topic with him about cross-training some additional help. For the second time, Sapo and Megahoof spotted salix trees that lacked the usual grove or glade that they could settle into. This concerned them both, curious if it was a harbinger of a wave of pollution or die-off of salix trees. Megahoof would need to investigate further by searching other glades to see if the pattern persisted, or if it was just a few isolated incidences that were coincidentally back-to-back. The two quickly searched for salix trees, as much like last time, they didn't want to stick around for very long. Spending time in yet another fully polluted glade would at least be a decent test of the new prototype hood. While they had no precise way of measuring pollution exposure, it would be clear enough if the hoods worked at least as well as the regular face masks once they returned home. The two divided up the labor. Sapo searched the west and Megahoof searched the east, and they'd shout to each other once a salix tree was spotted. Megahoof hauled the extracts into place and Sapo started digging up the roots. While Sapo dug, Megahoof readied the sledges. The two had enough experience at this point that they synchronized their efforts with astonishing efficiency. All three trees had been located and marked, and Megahoof warned Sapo of some hornets he had spotted too. Sapo joked with Megahoof that if they continued to work so quickly, they'd be returning home to a smogged castle. Megahoof laughed and then asked, "So, wait, you'd rather spend it out here?" and then gestured to the polluted filth of the boreal undergrowth. Sapo stammered and sheepishly replied, I guess not." "Then let's wrap this up then, shall we?" Megahoof said, and they hustled back to work. "You all set there?" Megahoof shouted. Sapo hollered back, "Sure am." The two prepped the sledges with bison and then packed up the supplies to return to the smoggy castle with 3 more salix trees for the boundary arboretum. Lazarus labored in the heelroot field, encumbered by a backlog of needed crop tending, a lack of a good mask, and the burden of full plate armor, while Dave used some of the newly made burlap to bag up polluted soil from just beyond the eastern castle gate. The castle seemed gloomy, with most of the windows shuttered to keep the smog out, leaving only a few hearth fires and lanterns to illuminate the towering black slate rooms. The low-light conditions didn't slow the Adlets down at all. They knew their darkened castle like the backs of their own paws. The Boundary Arboretum was protecting the castle from the encroaching pollution from the smog, just as the squires had suspected it would. The enormous effort put into planting trees all around their grove was paying dividends. Thank you for watching episode 35 of Hedge Knights, Klein's Weaving. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this series with your friends. If you would like to support me directly, a link to Patreon can be found in the description of this video. If you would like to join my online gaming community on Discord, a link can be found in the description as well. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, my fellow Adlets.